All right, so this lecture might actually be the most important of all of the lectures in this course. It's certainly one of my favorites to give because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings around the slave trade and how that worked. And Act 3 of our 5-act story is the nuts and bolts of the slave trade. And so there's a lot to go through, and let's just go ahead and get started. So really quick, what have we talked about thus far? What's been the rising action? So we're in the age of exploration, right? First Spain gets here. Columbus tries to enslave all the Taínos. They die very quickly, okay? So the Taínos didn't make very good slaves. Generally speaking, Native peoples in the Americas were terrible slaves because, one, they knew the land well enough to escape and run away quickly, and two, they were dying of European diseases. So you get that. Then you get other European countries going, interesting, right? So then you get Great Britain and Barbados and Jamaica. You get France and Haiti, Louisiana. You get Portugal in Brazil. And so you start to get this sort of European powers happening over in the Americas, first in the Caribbean and then spreading out from there, right? We talked about colonialism in Southeast Asia. We talked about colonialism in the Middle East. Those came later. However, in the 1500s, you also have India happening. And I just want you to keep that in your mind, that during this time period, you've got not just development in the Americas, you've also got it in India, okay? Which spearheaded by the Portuguese, but then you also have the British, the French, the Dutch, the Danish. You have other groups going into India and setting up their influence, okay? So it's a different system in India. We'll get to India eventually next week. But I want you to know that these European powers are not just in the Americas right now, okay? So, too often we talk about the slave trade as though its beginnings, its origins are common sense. And then the hard part to understand is how we were able to disrupt it. But I don't think it makes sense that that happened. I think it's one of the most cruel things humans have ever done to each other. And I think that how it was set up, what kind of things people were able to tell themselves about what's important is critical to us understanding how this started, because our economy is still rooted in the same values, okay? So we talked about all these people dying last lecture, Native Americans and European settlers, right? We talk about very high mortality rates among both. Why would they keep coming? Why would they keep coming to the Americas if all of this, if it's all death? And the answer is, as I'm sure you expect, money. See, the Americas, they always talk about the Columbian Exchange, right? There were all these plants and animals that were over in this side of the world, and then it came over here, and this came over there, and isn't that great, right? How could you have Italian food without tomatoes and peppers? How did you have, British food without potatoes? It's sugar, vanilla, chocolate, right? Meanwhile, how are you going to have, your margaritas without citrus fruits? How are you going to, okay. And it's always like, everyone got better. And, except for, the diseases, which I appreciate that it was not easy to find a Columbian Exchange that even mentions the diseases. Because of these different goods, and because some of these, particularly tobacco and a couple others, were extremely profitable. And because people were convinced that there was a whole lot of gold in North America, and they were obsessed with gold at the time, people kept coming because some people got rich. So when we think about the United States, and we think about how our economy is set up, this bootstrappy thing, one of the smartest things that I've ever heard was John Steinbeck describe Americans as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. We are still in this mind space where, yeah, many will play, but some of us are going to win big, and it's going to be me, baby. I'm not going to be the one that dies sick on the side of the road. If you look around 2020, maybe things haven't changed as much as we pretend they have, okay? So you had this demand for not just kind of land and imperial and strategic positions. That came later. It was the demand for commodities. And there are three big cash crops we're going to talk about, okay? Cash crop is something that you grow specifically for money to sell. You're not eating it, okay? Cash crop one, tobacco. So tobacco has a long history in native societies, like they talk about the peace pipes and that kind of thing. In 1528, the Spanish introduced tobacco to Europe. Europe goes crazy, right? They get hooked on it. They're like, oh my God, I don't know why it's so good, but I just need more. I need more. And then a little bit later, the British bring Virginia tobacco. Virginia tobacco is Flavor Town, all right? That's the smoothest, mellowest tobacco. And everyone goes nuts for Virginia tobacco. It becomes so popular that the king says, okay, only the colonies, the North American colonies, get to grow tobacco. Because last we checked in on Virginia, they were eating each other and ransoming children, okay? Things were not going well in Virginia. But tobacco grows great. It goes great. So the king said, look, no one in the Indies, in the Caribbean can grow this. Okay, only Virginia can grow it because they need the help. All right. Tobacco requires a lot of labor. So first of all, when you're in Virginia, you're talking about pine forests. So you've got to clear all these forests. You've got to clear all the roots and everything out of it, right? So we're probably going to look at slash and burn agriculture like we talked about before. And it's a really labor-intensive crop. It's nasty. It's filthy. You've got to have at least twice as many fields as you're producing because it has to lay fallow at least one season. Harvesting it is gross, and you've got to cure it, dry it, move it. Most cash crops require a lot of labor, okay? But they're worth it for the money. Where do you get this labor? Well, you can't get it from the Native Americans, right? They're dead or dying or sick or angry. And so you start bringing in African slaves. Okay, remember, the Portuguese in the late 1400s started getting slaves from some of these connections they had in Africa. Conquistadors brought some slaves with them on their journeys. They were like, wow, this is so convenient to have someone that can't quit on me. And so tobacco becomes heavily entwined with African slavery, okay? The second really important cash crop early on in the slave system was sugar, okay? So sugar is not an American plant. Sugar is actually from Asia. So the Europeans already had some experience with sugar. They loved it, but it was relatively rare. It wasn't easy to get because you had to ship it all the way from, like Southeast Asia. That was really hard. It was so expensive and so sought after. It was called white gold, In the 1550s, very early on, the Portuguese introduced sugar cultivation to Brazil. They bring some of their slaves to Brazil. They start cultivating sugar in Brazil. It's very, very easy to do, generally speaking. So sugar does very well in the Caribbean climate. But sugar is even more labor intensive and dangerous than tobacco. Sugar requires not just hard back-breaking labor in fields, in swampy conditions. It also requires these boiling rooms that are hot, where people get burned and maimed and crushed all the time. Sugar production is extraordinarily dangerous. Even now, it's extraordinarily dangerous, even with all kinds of new machinery and, OSHA standards and stuff. Sugar production is rough. Okay, remember what I said back in Uzbekistan about when you see cotton, you should go, whoop, uh-oh. Same thing with sugar, all right? So in 1641, colonial plantations really start exporting sugar. The Caribbean comes online as a sugar hub. During this time period, the fanciest dessert you could serve if you were a British fancy person was just straight up sugar cubes. Just sugar cubes. People go crazy, all right? So in the 1640s, slavery was formally legalized in the British colonies. So before this, you didn't really have British slavery, or it was kind of going, but in the 1640s, they were like, no, this is happening, and we're codifying it, and we're making it 100% above board legal to have these slaves. And it was primarily because of the sugar industry. And this changed the demographics of the Caribbean by, astronomically, okay? So before 1650, 3/4 of Barbados was white European, okay? In 30 years, the median size of the plantation had increased to about 60 slaves. The vast majority of the population was African slave. And this was, again, sugar. Sugar, sugar, sugar. And unfortunately, or whatever, part of the reason that you ended up with this race-based slavery system, where Africans particularly were the slave class, was partially related to health, just coincidences of location, okay? So most of the valuable land in the New World, in the Caribbean, even up in Virginia, in Brazil, were plagued by mosquitoes, by what's called hemorrhagic fevers, okay? So this mosquito bites you, gives you the virus, and usually you end up with flu-like symptoms, but it's an infection in your blood. It also gets in your brain. And malaria and yellow fever are the most common, most discussed versions of hemorrhagic fever that killed probably the most people during this time period. Malaria still kills, up until recently when COVID took over, malaria was the #1 deadliest infectious disease in the world still. Okay. There are other hemorrhagic fevers. Zika is a hemorrhagic fever. In DFW, we have West Nile virus. And in fact, one person this summer has already died of West Nile virus. West Nile virus was an emerging disease about 15 years ago. It was brand new. It is now an endemic disease. It is always here. And so we always have mosquito traps set up to try to identify if West Nile virus is in our mosquitoes. So here in Texas, we are vulnerable to hemorrhagic fevers and mosquito-borne illnesses. Right now, the only one that's in the system is West Nile virus. But if we let our guard down, we could get more, okay? We are not immune to malaria. Malaria can come back if our disease control falls apart. But here's the thing. So African people of African descent can get very sick from these diseases. I don't want anyone to think otherwise. But they will absolutely kick the asses of Europeans, okay? So when I talked about how Europeans have some, as a group, again, this is not necessarily at the individual level. You may not have this resistance. But as a group, Europeans generally are not as vulnerable to things like tuberculosis, smallpox, plague. As a group, Africans have more resistance to hemorrhagic fevers like malaria and yellow fever. And this is for the same reason. It's because they lived in a geography where they were exposed to it for a long time. The most famous version, the most famous adaptation, and kind of one of the things that we love to talk about when we talk about how it's not intelligent design, it's evolution, is sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is most common. It's among people of African descent. Sickle cell anemia is a deformation of your blood cells where instead of round, they're kind of like a sickle. They're kind of like a crescent shape. If you have 2 genes for sickle cell anemia, then you have these sickle-shaped cells, and it's very difficult. It's a very difficult disease to manage. However, if you only have 1 gene for it, then you don't have the sickle cells, but you do have protection against malaria, okay? The malaria can't really bind on your blood cells. Remember, hemorrhagic fevers are about your blood. Can't really bind on your blood cells, and you have some resistance to it. So when these diseases, malaria and yellow fever, would come through, you would see things like there was a yellow fever epidemic in Memphis in the 1800s, and it killed 90% of the white people it infected and like 20% of the black people it infected. So it was killing people, most definitely, but it was a huge difference in outcomes between European and African descent. So what this does is it creates this kind of brutal logic that says, well, if Africans can be out in the fields and other people can't, then they're most fit for it. They're the most effective, right? Because my investment isn't dying in the field. At this point, people start thinking about other human beings as their investments, like your car or something, right? And when you do this, when you say, oh, genetically or whatever, they're more suited for this work, that lets loose all of the worst kind of racist, eugenic sort of thought that we've seen around race-based slavery, right? So, oh, they're more like animals. Oh, they don't feel pain. Oh, they don't get bothered by the heat. Oh, all of this, right? And there's that grain of truth that says you're less likely to die of hemorrhagic fevers. That doesn't make any of the rest of it true. But it's there, right? It's there. Now, if you had an outbreak of something like smallpox, your African descended people were going to be in more trouble than your European. So essentially for a long time you just had dueling epidemics running through the Caribbean and the South, where you'd have a hemorrhagic fever come through and it'd kill a whole lot more Europeans, and then you'd have tuberculosis run through, would kill a whole lot more Africans. It was a bad scene for everyone, but much, 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 much worse if you were a slave, obviously. Oops. So, one side of this that I think gets the shortest shrift is supply. You've got all these people. Where'd these people come from, right? This isn't 5 or 6 people. This is millions of people. So we need to go to the supply side. So let's go back to the Kingdom of the Congo. You remember the Congo? Down by the Congo River. In 1483, Diego Cao, so Portuguese, arrives in the Congo, okay? And he meets with Nzinga Nkuwu, who is the king of Congo. And I will never stop sharing this painting. I love it so much. I just love the face on Mr. Nzinga there, who's like, what is your deal? Why are you here? Why are you wearing an outfit at the equator? So this starts like we saw with Benin, cultural exchange, right? You have nobles going back to Portugal, customs, education, goods, and what? Slaves, right? That's one of the things that's being exchanged economically. So by 1502, Congo is listed as a source of slaves for Portugal. By 1502, Portugal is kind of into slaves, right? They've had them for about 20 years at this point. And it's pretty cool, right? So we're still in this place where most of the slaves are war prisoners or prisoners of some kind, okay? They're captives. And Congo, like we talked about, was an expansionist empire. So they kept doing these campaigns of expansion. They were taking in all these war captives. They were able to sell them back to the Portuguese, and that would fund more expansion, okay? So for a little while there, the Congo was benefiting from supplying Portugal with slaves. So they would go out into a new area, consolidate power, and be able to make more money to have more wars by selling these captives to the Portuguese. Well, this led to, slavery at scale, where you started to ship shipments of human beings across the ocean. 1525, you have the first voyage directly from Africa to the Americas. Prior to that, everyone was going up to Europe. The king of Congo starts to get suspicious about this time that the Portuguese are enslaving people illegally, all right? Yeah, we have slaves, but they are prisoners of war. You don't just take people. You don't just take my citizens and enslave them. That's kidnapping and human trafficking. And he tries to talk to the King of Portugal about it. King of Portugal, of course, isn't having it. And so things turn ugly over the next 30 years, and the king is assassinated by the Portuguese. Now, at this point, everything falls apart. The Portuguese establish a colony next door. That colony basically is used to constantly fight incursions into Congo, because the more conflict you have, the more prisoners you can take and the more slaves you get. Okay? So, then Angola and Portugal start fighting wars against the neighboring kingdoms for sheltering slaves, i.e., protecting their people from being kidnapped. That is what is being called sheltering slaves. So now you've got this country, this European country, actually declaring war on African empires for protecting their people from human trafficking. Then you get another European country involved. You get the Dutch coming in and saying, hey, Congo, I'll help protect you from the Portuguese, but you need to pay me in slaves. I only take slaves as payment. All of this throws the Congo into civil war. Okay? And in civil war, everything falls apart. And so people fleeing, people fighting, people trying to get to refugee camps, all of them were prone to being kidnapped and put into slavery. The chaos in Africa was orchestrated and engineered by the Europeans for a very specific purpose, and that was to kidnap human beings and sell them for money. This happened all over Africa, and it happened for hundreds and hundreds of years. So next lecture, when we talk about Africa, modern Africa, I need you to understand this. I need you to understand that the chaos sown in Africa in the 1600s and 1700s was very much intentional and from the outside. Europe sees this. They say, wow, that's so smart of you, Portugal. Let's do it all over the place. So basically, these other powers start supporting slavery. Spain, Britain, and 1638, you get the first slave auction in Jamestown. Eventually, essentially, the west coast of Africa is transformed into a 3,000-mile-long slave coast. Okay, you get French in the Senegal area. You get the Dutch, Ghana, Benin, Togo, Nigeria. The British, largely from Gambia. And then in 1700, the British open it up to not just military, but to private citizens. Okay, private citizens in Britain can go down to Africa, kidnap people, and sell them across the ocean. That opens the triangle trade. Essentially, you have now officially made human beings a commodity that can be traded by private citizens. This is a picture of the door of no return at the slave palace in Ghana. If you were an African person who had been kidnapped by a slaver, you would get shoved into the slave palace, where you would sit in a dungeon for days, weeks, or months until they lined you up at this door. This was the last you saw of your homeland, put you on a ship, and sent you across the ocean. Remember, no one knew what ever happened to you. Yeah. So the triangle trade, you've probably heard about. That was Africa, Europe, and the Americas. It's a little more complicated than a triangle. Essentially, you've got slaves coming from Africa. You've got manufactured goods coming from Europe. And one of the things that drives me crazy about this is like, they're getting slaves and they're getting nothing but rum in return. That's not true. The slavers were getting all kinds of things. They were getting all kinds of money. They were getting guns. They were getting manufactured goods. Africa was very much involved in all of this. The other thing I want to draw your attention to with this, though, is the relationship between the Caribbean and North America. North America was feeding the Caribbean in a lot of cases because all of the land in the Caribbean was pretty much used for cash crops. And so they didn't have much land to grow food for their actual people in the Caribbean. And so North America and the Caribbean had been dependent on each other for a long time too. So we've got supply, we've got demand, now we've got logistics. How do we move that many people? And I'm sure you're familiar with the images of the slave ships, how people were packed in like they were an IKEA flat pack. The Middle Passage refers to the voyage across the ocean. It was a 21 to 90 day voyage, depending on how the winds were going, right? You didn't really have powered ships at the time. They were sails. And these voyages were plagued with epidemics. Of course, you had outbreaks of disease among everybody on the ship. Terrible weather. You'd run into hurricanes. Poor nutrition. Do you think they packed good food for these people? Pirates, right? Because humans are extremely valuable. A slave was essentially as valuable as a new car is today. So you had to deal with pirates and suicide. A lot of people, people were thrown off the boats. A lot of people jumped off the boats. There's stories of sharks following these ships across the ocean because they would feed on the corpses. 12.5 million people were taken, but only 10.7 made it. Nearly 2 million people died in the ocean on the trip to the Americas. And of those people who came, about 400,000 made it to North America. So about 4% of the people who made the Middle Passage, the slaves, came to North America. This is one of those things that I think we don't talk about enough. In the United States specifically, we talk about slavery in the United States as though we were the center of it, and we were not at all. We were edge of it. This doesn't at all negate the pain and suffering that happened in the United States. Let me make that very clear. But what we need to understand is that we were the edge of this, okay? The heart of it was in the Caribbean. And another thing that I hear that drives me insane is, well, if I had been taken into slavery, I would have fought back, as though somehow black people or African people are more docile or resigned to their fate. That's not the case. We believe that there were organized rebellions on at least 20% of the slave ships crossing the Atlantic, okay? And that's before you get off the ship. So they were fighting back. All right, people were always fighting back. Remember that. And here you go. Here is your slave trade map. So we talked about the kind of East African, North African slave trade in Lecture 1. Now you see the West African slave trade is much larger in scale. Most of the people of African descent in the Americas who were brought here during this time are from West Africa, from about Senegal down through Angola. 2.1 million people went to Brazil. 3.8 million went to the West Indies. Of those, 400,000 came to North America. You also had a bunch of people going into Europe, so the idea that, you know, Europe's hands are clean, they're not at all. Not just because they were making money hand over fist over this. Remember, at this point, Europe's just raking in the money. They're just raking in the money off of all of this, off these raw resources, off of slavery. Europe keeps getting richer because of this system here. We've got supply, we've got demand, we've got people now into the Americas. What was their life like, right? How was slavery in the Americas different from what we've seen in Africa? So your standard rules, it's generally race-based, typically Africans, okay? You'll see some variations, but generally your slavery status is based on if you're black or not. Children born to slaves, and sometimes children born to free blacks are automatically slaves. That is quite different from pretty much everything else we've seen in the world. That your child has no chance to not be a slave. They're born into slavery and they have no opportunity to get out of slavery without running away. A slave can never earn his or her freedom, so you can't earn enough money to buy yourself out or anything like that, okay? Unless a master decides to emancipate you, you have, again, no options except running away. By the way, the background of this slide is a quilt that's actually a map of the Underground Railroad, which of course is the most famous way in the United States. People ran away. And it had to be in all kinds of symbols because, of course, it's very illegal to have a map of the Underground Railroad. You had no familial rights. Families had no right to stay together, to have your child, to have your spouse, nothing like that. You couldn't appeal to the legal system. You couldn't really go to court. And the owner could sell you whenever he or she wished, okay? Depending on where you were, abuse, physical abuse was quite legal. In some places, up to killing a slave was legal. In other places, it was things like, oh, you can't beat them with a stick that's bigger than this or whatever. But you were always allowed to hurt them, to brand, to whip, to torture, and often rape. I mean, rape wasn't really going to be prosecuted no matter what color you were, but especially if you were a black woman. In many cases, a free white woman who married a slave, if that was allowed at all, in some places in the Caribbean it was allowed, but then she became a slave, okay? Of course, it didn't work if a white man tried to marry a black woman, of course, because intersectionality, right? We've got racism and sexism on top of each other. How much fun is that? So by 1700, this is what it looks like. you have in Hispaniola, okay, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, 90 to 100% of your population is slave, okay? In Cuba, you've got about half, okay? Now, once you get up to the American South, you're looking at between 30 and in some parts of like the Carolinas, 40 to 50%. So a smaller proportion of people are enslaved in North America and South America than in the Caribbean. It's still an important thing, but this is an important rule of thumb. The higher the proportion of slaves, the worse the conditions are for those slaves, because the more afraid the oppressors, okay, the owner class, the whites, are. And this is true not just of slavery, this is true of all economic systems. We talked about income inequality. Why does income inequality lead to authoritarianism, and income more equality leads more to democracy? It's because of that power imbalance. When you have a huge social power imbalance, you aren't going to have an egalitarian political system. That doesn't happen, okay? So if the more people you have who are oppressed, who obviously have a reason to be upset, the more brutal the ruling class will become against them. The more you'll see demonstrations of power against them, the more displays of force you will see against them and in general, just to remind everybody who's actually in control. All right? So, geography matters. Slavery in the Caribbean is not the same as slavery in North America. Both exceptionally horrible institutions, but there are differences and they're important. So in the Caribbean, our main crop was sugar. In North America, it was tobacco and cotton. We haven't gotten to cotton yet. Tobacco and cotton are really difficult things to farm, but sugar is much more difficult and much more dangerous. Life expectancy in the Caribbean was only 5 to 10 years upon arrival. So you get off the ship and you're expected to die within 5 to 10 years. They're going to work you to death. In North America, life expectancy for a slave was only 36. I'm 34. But it was only 40 for white people. So again, like I said, things were bad. Like, you didn't want to live there no matter what level you were. History sucks. Like, you don't want to go back in time. But there was a difference. It was a 4-year difference in life expectancy. But it was closer than in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, children of slaves, little kids, were considered burdens. You had to feed them and they couldn't even work in the fields. While in North America, they were considered assets because you could sell them for money. And this is one of the grosser parts of North American slavery, is that in a lot of ways people were treated like livestock. Like, you wanted them to have kids because then you could sell the kids. And that's really horrifying. But part of what this did was this meant that children, you had a very, very, very high child mortality rate in the Caribbean because there was nobody taking care of them. In North America, children were being taken care of to a certain extent, which led to natural increase, okay? So you had no natural increase, okay? So you had higher death than babies being born in the Caribbean. In North America, that's not the case. You had natural increase. North America is the only place in the Americas with slavery where you actually had natural increase of the African American population. So because you had no natural increase, you had higher death rates than birth rates. Slavery essentially ended with the end of the slave trade in the Caribbean because your supply was coming from Africa. Once the supply was cut off, you had to figure out what to do. But that wasn't the case in North America because the slave population had a rate of natural increase. So even though slave trade in the United States was ended around 1810, we were able to sustain slavery for 50 more years because of this natural increase. So, yeah, we were able to do it internally. Because also you were relying on new people coming in from Africa all the time, the Caribbean African diaspora tended, and to this day, tends to have a more intense connection with African heritage. So you didn't have much assimilation, okay? Because 90% of people are from Africa. So you don't have them trying to assimilate them into being white. Basically, they're running their own thing as long as they don't get rebellious, okay. So that's where you get Rastafarianism and you get Haitian voodoo. These are syncretistic religious traditions that are taking traditional African ideas and religions and kind of hooking them up with things like Catholicism or just Caribbean realities, okay? North America is different because you had this natural increase, because it was generation after generation after generation born in North American soil. And because you had a smaller population of them, you also had active assimilation efforts. You had people trying to punish them for having any kind of traditional belief system. A lot of times, you wouldn't even speak the same language as the other slaves when you first got off the ships, right? Because you were from all kinds of parts of Africa. And so if you had a smaller group of people, like on the North American plantations compared to the Caribbean plantations, you might not be able to find someone else from Gabon or some from Angola. And so you created more of a Pan-African sort of identity, which was then eroded over time into something much closer to the kind of the North American European, whereas you had a lot more difference, cultural space in the Caribbean. So my question is always, why don't Americans know anything about African countries? Okay, you can tell me the difference between an Irish person and a German person. You can tell me the difference between an Italian person and a French person. But you can't tell me the difference between a Ghanaian person and a Kenyan person, or a Botswanan person and a Tanzanian person. And why is that? And there are lots of reasons, but I think one of the big reasons is I have had plenty of encounters with Irish Americans who wanted to tell me all about Irish American history. And there's St. Patrick's Day, and there's all kinds of stuff like that. The Italian American pride, another thing. German Americans, another thing. African Americans do not have that luxury because they do not know what country, what empire, what tribe they were from. So African American pride is a very different thing. And it's very much tied up in all of this history. And so if you want me to come for you, the number one thing you should do is tell me that Kwanzaa is stupid. I grew up in a school district where Kwanzaa was very important. And Kwanzaa was an attempt to create a ethnic heritage holiday for people whose heritage was stripped from them, taken from them. And I would argue that this is a huge reason why we don't have a familiarity with African countries. Another is just that we've decided that their history isn't as important. And even when we teach slavery, we don't talk about the other side of it, what's going on in Africa, how Africa plays into all of this, right? Africa is always passive, it's always dark, and we need to get past that, okay? So, you ready? Let's talk some consequences. So you always had resistance. Like I said, Columbus's priests were like, whoa, what is happening? From the moment that people started making it very clear that America was going to be about violence, people had problems. missionaries had a lot of problems with taking human beings and making them slaves. 1595, Rey Amador, first known slave rebellion in the Americas, in Sao Tome and Principe. And you just have them all over the place. You get fugitive slave colonies in Brazil, right? So, I'm going to drop you off in Brazil. Okay, well, let's all run into the rainforest and, they're not going to find us, right? 1688 in the United States, the Mennonites issue a formal anti-declaration in Pennsylvania. It was the first kind of declaration like this created by white people. 1739, you have 3 slave revolts in South Carolina. If you've heard of the Stono Rebellion, that's kind of there. Kill 51 white people. Way more slaves died than 51, but this was enough to scare a lot of people into being more brutal with their slaves. 1751, you start getting big resistance in Haiti and then Jamaica. And then we get the American Revolution, okay? And the American Revolution is important, right? I am on a constant quest to get people to think about American exceptionalism differently. And one of those things is, in most cases, America is not exceptional. In most cases, when people say Americans do this or Americans do that, it's not just Americans. And in some cases, we are exceptional. Some things we did are pretty cool. One thing is that the American Revolution was the first anti-colonial revolution of this system, this period, okay? So the Americans say, hey, we don't want to pay your taxes. Get out of our colonies or whatever. And the British, smart, recruit slaves to fight against the colonial uprisings. In exchange, they said, we'll give you your freedom if you fight against the rebels. A bunch of slaves said, all right, sure, yeah, right? Even though the British lost, they relocated many of these soldiers to Canada, which remained a British protectorate. So you do have quite a bit of black descendants of these revolutionary soldiers in Nova Scotia. However, a lot of them were abandoned and reabsorbed into slavery. 1777, so pretty much immediately after the revolution starts, Vermont becomes the first state to abolish slavery. And as the new country tried to figure out who it was, what it was doing, right? 1785 is before we even have the Constitution. Jefferson and Madison, who were the framers of the Declaration of Independence and the primary framer of the Constitution, were slave owners. We know Jefferson had a long-term sexual relationship with a slave, which cannot be considered consensual because of the dynamics there. They're problematic figures. However, they also recognized that slavery was not sustainable. And so they were doing this gradual abolition thing, or trying to, and Virginia was not hearing it. They were not having it. But generally speaking, by the 1780s, slavery was starting to die out in many parts of the South. You were seeing fewer slaves, you were seeing smaller farms, laws were becoming less strict. Most people believed that the end of slavery was near. The profit margin on tobacco wasn't really enough to justify it anymore, and this is one of the reasons why you had all these compromises in the Constitution, why you had all these Southerners getting all upset about how you're going to count these black people and stuff, because generally the idea was, yeah, slavery's not going to last much longer. But something happened. And what happened was cotton production. Like we've talked about before, humans love cotton. Cotton is awesome. I'm wearing cotton right now. But cotton was extremely labor intensive, right? Cotton's thorny. It's got all of these seeds in it, and you had to pull all of this stuff out in order to process it. It was really niche, okay? You had to be really rich to afford cotton until 1794. So you weren't going to plant huge fields of cotton because you wouldn't be able to process it. Excuse me. However, in 1794, Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, and we're taught that he's somewhat of a hero. I don't think he meant, actually, we know that Eli Whitney was like, we're going to reduce the labor needed to make cotton. And instead what happened was you completely re-energized the slavery industry. Okay? So now all of a sudden, it's really easy to process this cotton. Cotton prices drop per bale, but cotton demand is out of control. And so growing cotton becomes extraordinarily profitable. This leads to what is called the Second Middle Passage. Okay? Tobacco was mostly farmed in the upper South, cotton in the lower South. We're talking about Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, into Texas. Second Middle Passage was the movement of all of these slaves down into the lower South. Okay? And this is the origin of the phrase sold down the river. Okay? The rivers head south. You don't want to get sold down the river because the further south you go, the more conditions start to resemble the Caribbean. You have these huge plantations, and the situation becomes more and more brutal because you have a larger proportion of slaves to overseers. The other thing that happens is instead of your owners, your masters, being in control, it's this intermediary group, overseers. Overseers do not have even an ownership interest in you, and therefore they tend to be even more brutal when the masters aren't involved personally, because usually they wouldn't live down in the plantations deep in the South because of malaria and yellow fever. A lot of times the owners, they lived in Nashville or even further north. So that means that they aren't even living with their slaves, which means that they don't see the brutality, which means that they're more likely to give orders for more brutality. This is a hallmark of the global economic system in which we live. The more distance, both physical and social, between the people making the demands and the people who have to carry out the demands, the more brutal it will become. Okay? The more the managerial class will ask of the worker class without any reward. And the more punishment instead of reward becomes motivating force. Okay? So from 1803 to 1937, all right, almost World War II, cotton is then America's leading export. We talked about Russia being a petro state. America was a cotton state. Cotton wealth didn't just build the South. Please understand this. The American South takes basically all of the responsibility for this system that built the North. It built New York City. It built the Southwest. It built our international relationships, because why would Britain have a good relationship with us? We just rebelled against them. Well, the reason is because we had all the cotton and they wanted it. We supplied 80% of Britain's textile industry, okay? So we would have been completely on the out if we didn't have this resource that Europe really wanted. Cotton built the United States. Slave labor built the United States. Not just the South, all of it. The South was the periphery. New York was the core, okay? We've already talked about that dynamic. And that is why after the Civil War, the South was left to its own devices. It's the periphery. And it's treated like such, almost like an internal colony. So, one of the most interesting consequences of slavery is that we get two new countries. Okay? So first, let's talk about Haiti and the Caribbean. Okay? So, in the 1780s, Saint Domingue, which becomes Haiti, produced 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee consumed in all of Europe. All of Europe. So Haiti was cash cow. So much money. It also accounted for a third of the slave trade. A third of the people brought over went to Haiti. Okay? That's like 3 million people plus. By 1789, 90% of the population of Haiti was slave. 90% was slave. 6% were white, and then 4% were mixed race free. So you had this weird system where you had a slave system and like a Jim Crow system for the free people at the same time. Okay? Haiti, French colony, was a mess. It was a mess. You had thousands, so Haiti is a really mountainous, pretty wild place. You had thousands of slaves that fled to the interior and created maroon societies where they would launch rebellions from time to time. Like I said, you had the discriminatory laws against free black people. And in 1791, you have a slave revolt beginning in the north. They burn down a whole bunch of plantations and start moving, right? Number one thing to do against settled people, burn down their stuff. Burn down their farms. In 1794, so in 1791, you start this revolution. This rebellion doesn't really quell. It just keeps going and going. At the same time, you have the French Revolution happening, right? Cut off the Queen's head, liberty, fraternity, equality, all of this. And so you get black people from Haiti petitioning to Robespierre, hey, if you're going to say that you're a revolutionary and that freedom, equality, and fraternity are what's important to you, how can you justify slavery? And after a little while of dragging their feet, they said, no, you're right. So the revolutionary government abolishes slavery in all French colonies. That didn't go over great with the landowners. And so you have this complicated war that lasts for like 10 years that involves plantation owners, Revolutionary Guards, the United States, Napoleon, former slaves, mulatto separatists, the British, Spanish, and then a bunch of pirates. It's a crazy time to be in Haiti. But things kind of settled, and then in 1802, see, Napoleon took France back over, right? The revolutionaries are out and now Napoleon's in. Napoleon's wife, Josephine Bonaparte, was from the Caribbean. She was from Martinique. And they decided that what they needed to do was bring back slavery in the Caribbean. After abolishing it, they were going to bring it back. So word reaches Haiti that after you've been free for 10 years, guess what? You're going to be a slave again. How do you think that went over? It didn't go over well. So you get the true Haitian Revolution at this point, okay? By the way, there's their Declaration of Independence, liberty or death. It was a real revolution. Former slaves were assisted by a malaria and yellow fever. So the French kept trying to come in, and they couldn't. Their people just kept dying because malaria and yellow fever. So once again, the hemorrhagic fever is rearing their heads during this period of time and changing history. You know why the Africans have more resistance. We talked about that a lot. So, I mean, 1804, Haiti says we're independent, and they basically killed all the whites. So they gave them a chance to flee. They said, you need to leave now. And the people that said, no, this is my property, and I'm staying, and I'm fighting, they were like, all right, and strung them up. Now, they didn't kill the Polish. So, France, Napoleon, was fighting a lot of wars at once. He was fighting land wars in Europe. He was fighting wars in the Caribbean. He was fighting all over the place. He was in North Africa. He was all over the place, all right? So, to get enough people to fight for him, he was hiring a lot of mercenaries, right? Hired guns. one of the groups of mercenaries that he hired for Haiti were these Polish mercenaries. And the Polish, during this time period, their experience, the reason that they were soldiers, they knew what they were doing, was because the Russians kept trying to take over Poland. And they were fighting off the Russians. They were Polish freedom fighters. So when they arrive in Haiti and they figure out what's actually going on, and they realize they were on the wrong side, that the side of freedom was the side of the Haitian people, the black Haitian people. And they switched sides. And they went to the Haitian leaders and they said, hey, we want to fight for you against the French. We don't think this is right. So when independence happened, the Polish were fine. They were welcome to stay in Haiti. And in fact, there are Polish villages still in Haiti where you can go get your Polish pastries and stuff. It's just one of those interesting stories. Geography. So, of course, this terrifies all the slave owners in the Americas, right? Images like this, oh, they didn't like this. They didn't like this at all. So slavery becomes even more brutal. You see even more torture, whippings. It's really bad. Okay? It's really bad. It gets really bad. Meanwhile, of course, the big powers, they don't like this new country of Haiti. They don't want this new country of Haiti to succeed, so they put an embargo on it. And for 20 years, Haiti has an embargo on it. Now, remember, Haiti's entire economy is set up to be an export cash crop economy. Sugar, primarily. And you cannot feed a country on sugar. You have to be able to sell it and buy food. They couldn't sell it, and they didn't know how to grow food because you weren't given education. Your education was your life experience, and your life experience was pretty much living on a plantation. So you have a lot of problems for those 20 years. Haiti isn't able to make money, and finally they agree to pay 90 million gold francs to France in exchange for official recognition and a lift of the embargo. Okay. This is a lot of money. France said that they had to pay it for restitution for the lost property of the colonists. Essentially what France said is you have to buy the freedom of all of these people. You have to buy the freedom of all of your citizens. So it's humiliating to say we are humans, we are not slaves, and still have to pay a slave price, right? But worse than that, Haiti couldn't afford 90 million gold francs. So what they do, they had to go to France, Britain, and the United States and take out loans, high interest loans, to pay that, to get that embargo lifted. They were not able to pay off those initial loans until 1947. In the meantime, of course, trying to build their country, they had to take out loans all over the place. And this is why Haiti is so poor. Haiti is so poor because they owe so much money to the large powers who essentially held them ransom because they were mad at them for rebelling against slavery. And this becomes the favorite tool of these large powers, United States, France, and Britain, for controlling countries after they lose physical control, okay? So after you no longer have control of that country, you no longer have colonial, imperial control, you can still control their actions by making them indebted to you. In Martinique, Napoleon was successful at reinstating slavery. You had people who were free for 10 years and all of a sudden they have slavery again for 30 more years for another generation. And I can't imagine the anger and outrage and pain that caused them. But you don't have to totally imagine it. This statue of Josephine Bonaparte in Martinique, of course, her home cannot keep its head on. They've tried fixing it many times, but someone will come back and cut her head off and throw red paint on her. And so this is now permanently how the statue is, and I love it. If you want to talk about, well, do we take down the statues or do we leave them up? Here's a way to leave them up and still be politically relevant. So the other country I want to talk about is Liberia. All right, Liberia is one of my very favorite countries to talk about, you guys. I love Liberia. So Liberia is the answer to the question, what do you do if you want to free your slaves, but you don't want free blacks in your town, or you think your slaves might kill you? Because you know they have a reason to, right? So the answer is Liberia. So what happened was you had the American Colonization Society set up, and what they were going to do is they were going to create a new colony for freed slaves in Africa, right? Back to Africa movement. So yeah, these are some of these manumission papers. Essentially, what they said was you can free your slave under the condition that they leave. Okay. So here's where Liberia is. It's right out on the edge of West Africa. There you go. All right. And you also had quite a few free blacks that went along to Liberia because in the 1820s, life for black people wasn't good in the United States. So it was an interesting experiment, right? So 1822, the first African Americans, or actually American Africans, settle at Monrovia, okay? And the initial plan was to have white governors. You were going to have this black colony, but it was going to be run by a white guy. Can you guess what happened? Monrovia is basically a swamp. It didn't last long because all these guys died of malaria and yellow fever very quickly. That is how Monrovia ended up being run independently by black people, because the white people kept dying of hemorrhagic fevers. Health, man. Liberia is such a weird story because it's almost a complete repeat of the Jamestown story, okay? They modeled their constitution after the U.S., copied the U.S. flag, named their capital after James Monroe, settled in a crappy, swampy spit of land, and at first really, really struggled to get any kind of toehold. Over the decades, you had about 16,000 people, former slaves, free blacks, move back across the ocean into Liberia. So in 1847, partially because they couldn't keep any white people alive, Liberia became the first African colony to become an independent state. So during this time period, actually, the only two independent states were Ethiopia, which was never colonized officially, and Liberia. Liberia is the only American settlement or toehold really in Africa. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, okay, who was a Virginian black man, was elected the first president of Liberia. And I just really think that that's important, and again, something that it's very sad that people don't know. I think that's a really important part of appreciating African American history, is that the first modern president in Africa was an African American man from Virginia. That's amazing, right? That's amazing. So, depending on how you want to spin it, Barack Obama wasn't the first African American president. Joseph Jenkins Roberts was. He was just president of a different country. But you have a problem. Your problem is that Liberia wasn't empty. Liberia wasn't unpopulated. There were 16 tribes there already, okay? And they did not want the American Africans back. They didn't know who these people were. They were just randos in weird clothes. They didn't want them here. And the settlers brought their American values about indigenous people, which was our entire lecture last week. what is an American value about indigenous people? Basically, assimilate or segregate, right? And unfortunately, that's what happened, okay? So the American Africans recreated what they knew. They recreated what they grew up in, what they saw. And so Liberia became a race-based plantation slavery society with forced native assimilation. It's very sad. And they also had to fight a nasty civil war about this. However, their civil war, where they were able to put it off until the 1980s and 90s. And it was a disaster. They're coming out of it now. They're rebuilding now. It ended in 2004. But, yeah, I think one of the most interesting juxtapositions is the Jamestown story and the Monrovia story, the Liberia story, and how brutal, predatory systems can be replicated even by the people who were brutalized and victimized by them. If we don't see what's happening, if we can't see how we're being used, if we can't understand how that system was set up, what the values of that system are, and if those are at all inappropriate values, then we ourselves can reproduce the violence that was inflicted upon us. Okay? Meanwhile, back in the United States, things aren't really going all that well, right? By 1960, basically, your lobbyists for slave-dependent industries, particularly cotton, had successfully pushed through all kinds of draconian measures to reinforce slavery. So this is the time period when we get the Fugitive Slave Act, right, where people can go in and pull slaves who have run away to free states back into slave states. That wasn't allowed before. You had aggressive pushing of slavery into the western states. And things were getting more and more out of control. Things were getting more and more brutal. Abolitionism was starting to gain in popularity in the North. And Lincoln was not an abolitionist at first. So Grant was raised strict abolitionist, but Lincoln really wasn't. It came later. You have Fort Sumter, you have the South start to secede, you had the Civil War happen, blip, 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 blip. Now, there was a possibility that the Civil War, our Civil War in the United States, was going to become a proxy war. That the British were going to step in in the South, and the French were going to step in the North, and they were going to pour gas on that fire. And we are very lucky that didn't happen. The American Civil War is by far the deadliest American war, deadliest war for Americans that has ever happened. It was a complete disaster. If you had thrown in the British and the French, it would have been horrific, okay? But why didn't that happen? Remember that I said that Britain got 80% of their cotton from the United States. So why didn't they step in to defend the southern cotton industry? Before the Civil War, check it out. By the way, I'm sorry that my map is en français. This was the only map I can actually find of this. This is old French map. Before the Civil War, 1858, the vast majority of cotton is coming from the United States, right? Like Tunis. And there's that little orange line coming around Africa, that's Indian cotton, okay? Once the Civil War breaks out, the British changed their supply system. Remember that they had been in India for a long time. India can grow cotton. So instead of trying to fight this war in the United States, they instead changed and put their resources into pumping up Indian cotton and also like Mediterranean, Middle Eastern cotton production, right? Egyptian cotton. This is the time when that becomes like cool, okay? Egyptian cotton wasn't a thing before. So that is what they decided put their resources into, maybe it's time to go exploit a different region more heavily. And after the Civil War, that stayed. They kept that, okay? So at this point, the British really turned their focus the other direction to India and Middle East and Africa and away from the Americas, okay? This is high world geography, my friends. So during the Civil War, the wealthiest plantation owners fled to New York City if they weren't there already. Like I said, your richest people, the people who are the most dangerous making the calls, are going to be the most insulated. They were welcomed with open arms, okay? The New York socialites weren't like, oh my goodness, slave owners. They were like, oh good, it's Bonnie, like they knew who these people were. They were all friends. You get the Emancipation Proclamation halfway through the war, so the slaves are free. Of course, they're not really free, and the rebelling, but essentially the war becomes officially about freeing slaves about halfway through. Now, at the end of the Civil War, you had 4 million new free people, and nothing was done to help them. Okay? The South was destroyed. Most of the war was fought in the South. South was destroyed. Lots of fields, crops burned. You had many, many, many men dead or maimed. The slaves were no longer slaves. And essentially you had 10 years of famine and lawlessness in the South, where, of course, most of your freed slaves were. So was the intention actually to make life better for black people? No. No. There were no jobs, there was no food, there were no homes, nothing. You were just going to let them die in the street. It was different motivation. It was financial motivation. Slavery was no longer financially viable. And so this is the situation in which kind of the modern American economy would form. Okay? So, the end of this lecture is abolition. And, of course, slowly starting in Haiti in 1804 and ending in kind of Cuba in the 1880s, you get abolition spreading across the Caribbean, South America, and North America. Okay? By 1900, slavery in its transatlantic form, the way that we understand that black-white slavery thing, is abolished officially. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about if that actually changed the economic system and to what degree. Okay.